Thank you so much for having me here. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here in Puebla. I'd like to begin by telling you a story. It's a story that takes place on the second day of the ground invasion of the First Persian Gulf War in February 1991. And it stars Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley, who's in the radar room of the HMS Gloucester, a British battleship. His job this morning in the pre-dawn hours is to watch out for silkworm missiles. These are massive Chinese-made missiles that the Iraqis have been threatening to launch at the Allied convoy. It's a flotilla of 22 American battleships, destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers that are behind him. They've been threatening to launch these silkworm missiles, and so Michael Riley's job is to watch out for silkworm missiles on his radar screen. There he is, staring at his screen, 5:01 in the morning, when he sees 2 neon green blips. And as soon as he sees these 2 neon green blips just off the Iraqi coast, he's convinced that these are silkworm missiles. He's seized by a very, very intense motion of fear. His hands get sweaty, his pulse starts to race, adrenaline pours into his bloodstream. In fact, he's so scared that he gives the order to prepare his sea darts. Those are his sea-to-air missiles which can shoot down the silkworm missiles, to prepare them to fire. But Michael Riley has a problem. Although his emotions are convinced that these 2 blips are silkworm missiles, rationally he knows that these 2 neon green blips on his radar screen could just as easily be 2 American A-6 fighter jets. You see, for the previous 6.5 weeks, he's watched A-6 fighter jets take off from the aircraft carriers behind him, drop their bombs in Iraq, complete their mission, and then go wet feet. That's a technical term for when they become visible on his naval radar, at a very similar spot just off the Iraqi coast. So here is his terrifying dilemma. He's got 45 seconds to make a decision. On the one hand, he knows that if these are silkworm missiles and he does nothing, he doesn't shoot them down, then an American ship is about to be sunk. 700 sailors will die. It'll be the most devastating encounter of the war for the Allies, and he'll have watched it happen. He will have failed to execute his mission. On the other hand, if these are 2 A-6 fighter jets and he shoots them down, then 4 American pilots are about to die. He'll be court-martialed, his career will be over, he's going to tell his commanding officer that he killed these pilots because he got scared one morning, which is not a very good excuse. The 45 seconds are up. Michael Riley has to make a decision. He gives the order to fire. He watches as his sea darts leap into the sky. He watches as the sea darts get closer and closer to these 2 blips, whatever they are. Then he watches as 1,000 yards in front of the USS Missouri, these 2 blips fall out of the sky. He shot them down. At this point, his commanding officer runs into the radar room and says, "Lieutenant Commander Riley, congratulations on shooting down those silkworm missiles. How did you know they were silkworm missiles?" Lieutenant Commander Riley is forced to tell his boss, "I don't know. I just had this feeling." Needless to say, his boss isn't thrilled with this answer, sends Riley back to the tapes to try to find some justification, some scrap of evidence to prove that these were in fact silkworm missiles and not A-6 fighter jets. Half an hour later, Riley comes back and says, "You know what? I looked at the tapes and the tapes are ambiguous. These look like A-6 fighter jets to me now." Now people are really nervous. They send out crews to scour the wreckage floating on the surface of the ocean. They do a complete inventory of every A-6 fighter jet that's out there. 4 hours later, the answer comes back. These are the longest 4 hours of Michael Riley's life. And they finally learn after 4 hours that Michael Riley had shot down 2 silkworm missiles, that he had saved the USS Missouri from being sunk. After the war is over, the British Navy goes back and investigates Michael Riley's decision. They want to know, how did he get so smart? How did he actually make this decision? Because, of course, he wasn't the only radar operator in the area that day. There are actually 4 other radar operators using more sophisticated equipment, and yet they all assumed these were A-6 fighter jets. He was the only one who got scared. He was the only one who sounded the alarm. He was the only one who fired off his sea darts. So how did he make this decision? The British Navy goes back and reviews the tapes, and they conclude, based on their investigation, that Michael Riley got lucky, that he was a hero but he was a lucky hero. He could have just as easily shot down 2 American fighter jets. Case closed. 2 years go by, and a cognitive psychologist named Gary Klein hears the story of Michael Riley. Gary Klein is probably best known for studying the intuitions of firefighters. You know, firefighters can run into a burning building, smell some smoke, see some flames. They have these very powerful intuitions about how they should fight this fire, what they should do. And it turns out, even though they can't explain where these intuitions come from, why they're doing it this way, their intuitions are very, very accurate. So that was Gary Klein's background, and that was the attitude he brought to the story of Michael Riley. He got access to the tapes, only he didn't just look at the radar tapes from that morning, from the second day of the ground invasion. Instead, he looked at the radar tapes from the previous 6.5 weeks, trying to find some difference, some discrepancy between the pattern of blips Michael Riley had gotten used to seeing from the A-6 fighter jets and the pattern of blips he saw that morning at 5:01 in the morning. And after a couple days of analysis, Gary Klein saw the difference, and the difference was this. At that point in their journey, the A-6 fighter jets, when they go wet feet, when they hit the Persian Gulf, they're traveling at about 10,000 feet, which meant there was no ground interference. On the other hand, the Silkworm missiles at this point in their journey, they're traveling at about 3,000 feet, which meant there was just a little bit of ground interference. And that interfered with when the radar system could pick it up. That meant Michael Riley's 909 naval radar couldn't pick up these 2 blips until 2 to 3 seconds later on the 3rd sweep of the radar screen. And it was that slight timing delay, that discrepancy he couldn't even explain, that, Gary Klein argued, is what led Michael Riley to feel that something just wasn't right. And it was that feeling of fear, those sweaty hands, that racing pulse, that is what led him to give the order to fire and save the USS Missouri. Now, I love the story for all the obvious reasons. You know, it sounds like something out of a novel or a Hollywood movie. But I think it illustrates something very important about how our emotions work and what our emotions are up to. You know, for thousands and thousands of years, really ever since Plato, we've seen our emotions as these wild horses in the brain, these things that lead us astray, these hardwired instincts that lead us to take out subprime mortgages and run up credit card debt and sleep with the wrong people and eat too much ice cream. Our emotions are bad things. You know, they're things we should repress and hide away. But I think what the story of Michael Riley illustrates is that our emotions can also be incredibly wise. They can often be incredibly prophetic, that in many respects, our emotions know more than we know, that they can take in more information than we're even consciously aware of. And I'd like to talk about how this happens in the brain at a very fundamental level by telling you about dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that your brain cells use to communicate with each other. And if you've heard about dopamine, it's probably because of its dodgy reputation. You know, dopamine is the neurotransmitter of hedonism, of reward. It's the thing that makes us like sex, drugs, and rock and roll a little bit too much. And to be fair, dopamine does do that. Dopamine is responsible for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But in recent years, scientists have also come to realize that dopamine isn't just about pleasure. That dopamine is also a crucial chemical that allows us to make sense of reality, to translate the helter-skelter of the world into neat chains of causation and correlation. I'd like to talk about this in terms of the work of a scientist named Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge University and Caltech. And he first got interested in dopamine because of its association with reward. So he'd do very simple experiments where he would give a monkey a squirt of apple juice, and monkeys love apple juice. It is like their favorite thing in the world. So he'd give a monkey a squirt of apple juice and measure the activity of individual neurons in the monkey midbrain. And what he found is that sure enough, give the monkey a squirt of apple juice, a dopamine neuron fires in the midbrain, the monkeys get happy, right? That's how it's supposed to work. Dopamine tracks rewards. But then he found something kind of interesting, which is that if you kept on giving the monkeys these squirts of apple juice, after just a couple squirts, these dopamine neurons stopped firing. They got bored by the reward. They habituated to it. They adapted to it. And this also makes a little bit of sense. It's why that sweater we get for Christmas is so exciting the first time we wear it. Then after that, it's just another thing in our closet. Or why that new cell phone is thrilling the first 2 days. Then before long, it's another thing in our pocket. In other words, we are naturally ungrateful. And we can begin to understand why by looking at how dopamine neurons get bored very quickly by squirts of apple juice. But then Schultz found something very, very odd. So one day he's just walking into his lab, and he opens up the door to his lab. And as soon as he opens up the door, he hears the distinctive sound of dopamine neurons getting excited. And this is very confusing to him. Why are these neurons so excited? He hasn't given them any squirts of apple juice. What are they responding to? That's when he thinks, well, maybe these neurons know that every time I open the door, that in just a few minutes, the experiments will begin, that I will start giving them squirts of apple juice. Maybe this is an expectation of reward. So he sets up this simple experimental protocol where he would ring a bell and give the monkeys a squirt of apple juice. And sure enough, after just a couple trials, these dopamine neurons stopped firing in response to the apple juice and started firing in response to the bell. And if he flashed a light before ringing a bell, before the squirt of apple juice, they would fire whenever he flashed a light. And if he played a song before flashing a light, before ringing a bell, before the squirt of apple juice, they would fire whenever he played a song. In other words, they didn't care about apple juice per se. They didn't actually care about rewards. Instead, they wanted to find the first event in time that predicted the arrival of the reward. They wanted to find the pattern that led up to the apple juice. Now the question becomes, how do these cells get so smart? How does this little circuit actually figure out the lights and the bells and the apple juice? Well, here's where something called prediction errors become so essential. So let's say you're in a mischievous mood and you've trained these monkeys, flash a light, ring a bell, squirt of apple juice. What happens if you flash a light, ring a bell, and don't give them monkeys a squirt of apple juice? What happens then? Well, the first thing that happens, you get a pissed off monkey. It's expecting its delicious squirt of apple juice, but nothing arrived. It's a little annoyed. But you see at the level of these neurons that they fire off this characteristic signal called a prediction error signal, which is their way of saying, oops, we made a mistake. We thought we knew what was going to happen, but it turns out we were wrong. And so they recalculate, they rejigger their expectations the next time they get it right. That's what they're always trying to do. They're always trying to minimize the gap between what they expect, between their predictions and their prediction errors. This turns out to be an incredibly efficient way to make sense of the world. In fact, it's so efficient that computer scientists are now using the same basic prediction error algorithm, the software running on our 3 pounds of wet meat right now, to program cell phone towers, banks of elevators, to make sense of the stock market. The best backgammon player in the world is a simple software program, taught itself how to play backgammon using prediction error algorithms, and it can now beat any human player in the world. This is a great way to take a complex system and find the subtle patterns in it. It's all about noticing your mistakes and prediction errors. I think it also allows us to go back and begin to understand what was happening inside the brain of Michael Riley, those pre-dawn hours in the second day of the ground invasion. So there he is, staring at those two blips, and consciously, to his conscious brain, these look just like A-6 fighter jets. But some dopamine neuron somewhere in his midbrain says, this isn't the pattern I've come to expect. So it fires off a prediction error. That signal is passed from synapse to synapse, cell to cell, till it reaches a brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex, which neuroscientists sometimes refer to as the oh shit circuit, because it's triggered by negative surprises, contradictions, states of uncertainty, stuff like that. That is the brain area that then magnifies its computational signal till it's a bodily emotion, till our hands are sweaty and trembling, until our heart rate is racing ahead of us. And it's that bodily feeling, that visceral emotion, that inarticulate fear that we can't explain, that is what led Michael Riley to give the order to fire. Now, I think there are two very important lessons we can all draw from this new model of emotion, from being able to understand where our emotions come from at a very fundamental level in the brain. The first is mistakes are really important, that the brain learns how to get it right by getting it wrong again and again and again. There is no way to make accurate predictions about the future without having made lots of prediction errors in the past. That is simply the way we were designed to learn. It's very efficient, it's very effective, but it requires us to make mistakes. One of my favorite quotes is from Niels Bohr, who said, "An expert is simply someone who has made all the mistakes there are to make in a very narrow field." And from the perspective of your brain, that's exactly right. I think this is also important. It's an important idea to incorporate into the classroom. Carol Dweck, she's a psychologist now at Stanford, she did a classic experiment a few years ago with hundreds of school children in the New York City public schools, took them and randomly divided them into 2 groups, gave them a test at grade level. One group, after the test was over, she says, "Good job, you must be really smart." Second group, after the test was over, she says, "Good job, you must have really tried hard." That was the one difference, that one line of praise. That was the only difference between these 2 groups. But she noticed that this one line of praise actually had a big impact on how these school children thought about learning. The kids she praised for being smart, when she gave them an assortment of tests to choose from, they wanted to take the easier tests, right? Because if they took a hard test and made lots of mistakes, that meant they were stupid. That meant they weren't smart. Every mistake was an insult to them. When they got their test back, they were much less interested in looking at their mistakes, looking at their wrong answers. Why? Because that made them feel bad. That was a sign they weren't nearly as smart as they thought they were. The group she praised for trying hard, on the other hand, they were much more interested in taking harder tests. They wanted to push themselves. When they got their tests back, they were much more interested in looking at all the mistakes, looking at all their errors, and saying, "Geez, why did I get that wrong? What mispredictions did I make here? What were my errors? Why did they occur? And how can I not make the same errors the next time?" After a couple months of this, she then got all the kids together, gave them all the same test just above grade level. The kids she praised for trying hard scored 30% higher than the kids she praised for being smart. That's simply because that one line of praise changed the way they thought about mistakes. It changed the way they thought about learning and about their prediction errors and about how useful they are. So there is no, as Bob Dylan said, there is no success like failure. We need to make prediction errors before we can make accurate predictions. The second really important thing I think this research in dopamine can teach us is what expertise really is. I think we've got this cliche of experts. What defines experts? So they've got all these explicit facts in their head, you know, that when you ask them a question, they can call upon all their time in graduate school, all this knowledge stuffed inside their brain, that they're somehow more rational, more knowledgeable than the rest of us. But when you watch experts in the wild, when you look at how football players and firefighters and lieutenant commanders and chess grandmasters, when you watch experts in the field, what you find is that they're actually profoundly intuitive, that they're much more intuitive than us amateurs. Why? Because they've learned to trust their emotions. They know that their experience, all those years of practice and mistakes, it's been embedded in their emotions. It's not in all those facts they can cite. It's stuffed inside these feelings they can't even begin to explain. So the next time your hands get sweaty, the next time your pulse is racing, the next time you're saturated in this emotion you can't even begin to explain, don't try to hide it away. Don't try to suppress it. Don't try to outthink it. Instead, ask it a few questions. Ask this emotion, what is it responding to? What information is it picking up out there that's making you so scared or so happy or so nervous? What is it about the world that is triggering this feeling? How much experience do you have in this domain? Have you made the necessary mistakes? Because if you've made those necessary prediction errors, then chances are that feeling knows more than you know. And that's what it's trying to tell you. Thank you so much for having me here. It really is an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.